At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, John Thatch observed 6 Japanese Zeros diving toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island, aware that his pilots had roughly 90 seconds before they would be lost. He was 37 years old with 214 flight hours in Wildcats and no victories against Zeros. The Japanese had deployed 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters to clear American patrols from the morning sky. Thatch's Wildcat was slower. The Zero climbed faster, turned more tightly, and could outmaneuver any American fighter at nearly any altitude. Japanese pilots understood this advantage, and American pilots did as well. The calculation was direct and unforgiving. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in 14 seconds. 14 seconds to get behind, 14 seconds to aim, 14 seconds to shoot down the target. By February, the United States Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one engagements with Zeros. 43 pilots attempted to turn with them. 43 losses followed. The pattern remained constant. An American pilot spotted a Zero, turned to engage, was outmaneuvered, and then shot down. Command continued issuing the same guidance. Avoid turning fights. Withdraw if possible. But withdrawing meant leaving others exposed. It meant allowing Zeros to attack fellow pilots while you pulled away. Thatch led Fighting Squadron 3. 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men relying on his leadership to survive. Yet he had no clear solution to the Zero's turning ability or climb performance. He had no answer except to watch capable pilots fall. 3 days earlier, Thatch had been in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, looking at a small box of matches. His wife had included them in a care package, 20 wooden sticks in a simple box. He had been thinking about the Zero problem for weeks. How do you defeat an opponent that can outturn you? How do you stay alive when the enemy is faster, more agile, and flown by experienced pilots? Thatch picked up 2 matches and held them parallel. Then he moved them in opposite directions, passing them across each other. They crossed, then crossed again, never separating, always supporting one another. At that moment, the idea formed clearly. What if 2 Wildcats did not fight separately? What if they operated as a pair, weaving back and forth? If a Zero moved onto one Wildcat's tail, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They would cross paths, and the Zero chasing the first aircraft would fly into the second pilot's line of fire. The concept was unconventional. It went against established fighter doctrine in the Navy manual. Fighters were expected to engage alone. Pairs stayed together only for navigation, but once combat began, they separated into individual fights. This had been standard practice since 1918. Yet Thatch could not ignore the image of those matches moving together, and he could not ignore the record of 43 lost pilots. He called his wingman, Edward O'Hare, into his quarters that night. He demonstrated the idea using the matches and explained the weaving motion. O'Hare studied them briefly, then looked at Thatch and asked when they would test it. 4 days later, Thatch was about to determine whether this approach would protect his pilots or put all 4 at risk. The 6 Zeros were about 200 yards away and closing quickly. Thatch reached for his radio. It was time to attempt a method that had not been used in combat. It was time to see whether 2 coordinated aircraft could counter 6 Zeros. His voice came over the radio with a clear instruction. "Weave on my signal." His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was positioned 800 feet to his right. 2 additional Wildcats, flown by ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Carlson, were another 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose formation, with 6 enemy aircraft descending from 11,000 feet. Standard procedure called for separation and independent engagement. Instead, Thatch gave a different order. "Bassett, stay with me. Begin weave pattern. Execute." Bassett turned his Wildcat toward Thatch. Thatch turned toward Bassett. They flew directly toward each other. The Zeros descended to 8,000 feet. The Japanese pilots likely interpreted the movement as confusion or loss of control. It may have appeared that the two Wildcats were on a collision course. However, they did not collide. At around 400 yards, both pilots banked sharply. Thatch moved left, Bassett moved right. They crossed paths with about 200 feet between them. Then they continued turning, preparing to cross again. The pattern formed a figure 8. Two aircraft moving back and forth in coordination, similar to the motion Thatch had practiced with the matches. The lead Zero selected Bassett as the target and moved into a tail pursuit, closing to 600 yards. This followed standard Zero tactics. Close distance, rely on maneuverability, and engage with cannon fire. The Zero pilot likely expected Bassett to attempt a defensive turn. Instead, Bassett turned toward Thatch. The Zero followed, aligning for a shot. The distance closed from 500 yards to 400 yards. The target was centered, and the pilot was seconds from firing. At that moment, Thatch's Wildcat came through the pattern from the opposite direction, directly into position. The Zero pilot now faced a new situation. He was pursuing Bassett, but Bassett was moving straight toward another Wildcat, and that aircraft had its guns aligned directly at him. John Thatch opened fire at 300 yards. The 50 caliber machine guns delivered about 70 rounds per second. The Zero pilot had only one option: break off the attack or continue into concentrated gunfire. He broke away, turned sharply to the right, and climbed. The remaining 5 Zeros dispersed. For the first time in Pacific combat, Zeros were disengaging from Wildcats. Sheedy and Coulson had observed the maneuver in action. They then applied it themselves. Sheedy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheedy. Two more Wildcats began weaving. Another Zero selected Coulson and closed to 400 yards. Then Sheedy crossed through the pattern, and the Zero pilot reacted, pulled up, and disengaged. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. 6 Japanese Zeros against 4 American Wildcats. The expected outcome would have been the loss of all 4 American aircraft. However, when the Zeros eventually withdrew and headed northwest, all 4 Wildcats remained operational. Thatch checked his fuel and confirmed the status of his wingmen. No aircraft were hit and no pilots were lost. The weave had proven effective. Thatch landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later. His hands were unsteady, not from fear but from the intensity of the moment and the realization that American pilots might not be at a constant disadvantage against Zeros. Fighter Command remained cautious. Thatch submitted his combat report that same day. He described the maneuver, explained its function, and recommended immediate adoption across all squadrons. The response arrived 3 days later. The tactic was considered interesting but required further evaluation and was not approved for general use. Thatch reviewed the response carefully. Dozens of pilots had already been lost, and command still requested more testing. At the same time, Japanese forces were preparing a larger operation. This would test the weave under far greater pressure, because in 68 days, Thatch would be operating over Midway Atoll, facing approximately 50 Zeros with only 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, Thatch trained Fighting Squadron 3 on the weave every day. Training flights were conducted in the morning, afternoon, and at night when visibility allowed. His pilots practiced the pattern until execution became automatic. Turn toward the wingman, cross, turn back, and cross again. The concept was simple, but applying it at high speed under combat conditions was demanding. The Navy had still not formally approved the tactic, but Thatch continued training without waiting. He instructed every pilot willing to learn, demonstrated the concept with matches, and illustrated the geometry on boards. If a Zero moved onto your tail, you turned toward your wingman. The Zero then had to decide. Continue into the second pilot's line of fire or disengage. Either outcome increased survival chances. Some pilots accepted the method immediately. Others were doubtful. One squadron commander argued that the WWII conflicted with established doctrine. Flying toward another aircraft in combat increased the risk of collision and confusion. However, Thatch continued teaching because losses continued. By May, the United States Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. Each loss represented another pilot and another notification sent to families. Despite this, official guidance remained unchanged. Avoid engagement when possible and withdraw when outnumbered. These instructions offered limited practical protection in combat conditions. Naval intelligence then intercepted Japanese communications. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor decoded the messages. The Japanese were planning a major attack on Midway. The operation involved 4 aircraft carriers and about 270 aircraft, making it the largest carrier strike assembled by Japan at that time. The attack was scheduled for June 4, 1942. Chester Nimitz ordered all available carriers to assemble. The United States had 3 carriers, USS Yorktown, CV-5, USS Enterprise, CV-6, and USS Hornet, CV-8. Japan had 4 carriers, along with experienced pilots and aircraft that outperformed American fighters in maneuverability. The balance of forces was unfavorable. American carriers were fewer, and their pilots faced significant disadvantages. Midway Island itself had limited defenses and was vulnerable to early bombing. Fighting Squadron 3 received deployment orders on May 26. They were to report to the Yorktown and prepare for carrier operations. Thatch understood the implications. His squadron would conduct combat air patrol over the carrier during the expected attack, defending against bombers and engaging enemy fighters. He assembled his pilots that evening. 7 men, 7 Wildcats, each depending on a tactic that still lacked official approval. Thatch demonstrated the WWII again and explained its importance. He then presented the situation clearly. The Japanese would likely bring around 50 Zeros to Midway. The squadron would have only 8 Wildcats, possibly fewer depending on earlier losses. Their ability to survive and protect the carrier depended on executing the WWII effectively. One pilot raised a direct concern. What if the method failed? What if they used the WWII and were still shot down? Thatch did not provide a detailed answer. Instead, he demonstrated the matches again. He showed how 2 objects moving together could support each other, maintain coverage, and improve their chances of survival in conditions where operating alone would likely result in loss. USS Yorktown, CV-5, departed Pearl Harbor on May 30. 4 days remained to reach Midway. 4 days to prepare for a battle that would shape the Pacific War. 4 days to rely on a simple matchstick concept working against a large number of Zeros. On June 4 at 0930 hours, John Thatch would look up and face a situation no American pilot had encountered before. A sky filled with Japanese fighters. On June 4, 1942 at 0930 hours, Thatch was flying at 14,000 feet above Yorktown when the first Japanese strike group appeared. There were 18 Aichi dive bombers with 12 Zeros providing escort. It was not the larger force intelligence had expected, but 12 Zeros still created a 3-to-1 advantage against Thatch's 4 aircraft section. The Zeros approached from higher altitude at 15,000 feet, following standard Japanese tactics. They secured height advantage, then prepared to dive and use speed and maneuverability to control the fight. Thatch counted the enemy aircraft and then his own. 4 Wildcats against 12 Zeros. He transmitted the order. Begin weave pattern on my signal. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 600 feet to his right, with 2 more Wildcats positioned behind. The Zeros began their dive. Thatch observed them commit and select targets. 3 Zeros moved toward him, 4 targeted Bassett, and the rest continued toward Yorktown. Thatch gave the command to execute. He turned sharply toward Bassett and Bassett turned toward him. They crossed paths at 12,000 feet. The 3 Zeros pursuing Thatch encountered an unexpected situation. Their target was heading directly toward another Wildcat that had its guns aligned toward them. The lead Zero pilot hesitated briefly. Even a short delay at combat speed covered significant distance. Thatch crossed through the pattern and opened fire. The .50 caliber round struck the Zero's engine area. The aircraft rolled left, released smoke, and dropped away. This was Thatch's first confirmed Zero kill. The remaining 2 Zeros did not disengage. They recognized the pattern and adjusted their approach. Instead of following directly behind, they separated. One climbed while the other moved lower, attempting to attack from different directions and force Thatch into a difficult choice. Thatch climbed toward the higher Zero while Bassett moved to engage the lower one. For several seconds, the formation broke and both Wildcats operated separately. This was the situation Thatch had intended to avoid. The higher Zero aligned its guns on Thatch at 800 yards. Cannon fire struck his left wing. 2 rounds penetrated the wing root, and 1 passed through the canopy close to his head. Thatch felt the impact and fragments striking his flight gear, but he maintained control and continued turning. Bassett reported over the radio that he had been hit. Thatch looked in his direction and saw Bassett's Wildcat releasing white smoke, indicating a coolant leak or possible engine damage. The lower Zero remained behind Bassett, continuing to fire. Thatch made a decision. He stopped his engagement with the higher Zero and moved down toward Bassett. Even though the weave formation had broken, the principles still applied. Position yourself between your wingman and the threat. Thatch descended toward the lower Zero from above and behind. At 600 yards he closed further, then at 500 and 400 yards he opened fire. The Zero was destroyed and broke apart in the air. Bassett's aircraft was unstable and losing altitude. He reported engine overheating and stated he was returning to Yorktown. Thatch instructed him to proceed and directed the other 2 Wildcats to escort him. This left Thatch alone at 11,000 feet with multiple Zeros still present. The weave was effective with coordinated aircraft, but alone he was in a vulnerable position. Thatch turned toward Yorktown and began descending. A Zero identified him and moved to intercept. He scanned the area for support and identified 4 Wildcats from another squadron about 3 miles to the east. They were visible but too far to provide immediate assistance. The 3 Zeros continued closing. John Thatch had no wingman and no weave available, and no clear option except to withdraw. However, withdrawing would draw the Zeros toward USS Yorktown, CV-5, the carrier his squadron was assigned to defend. He used his radio and requested support, informing the other Wildcats that he was engaging 3 Zeros alone. He stated that if the tactic worked they would have confirmation, and if it failed they should pass a final message to his family. Thatch then turned his Wildcat toward the 3 Zeros and prepared to test whether the same concept could sustain a single pilot. At 9,000 feet, the 3 Zeros entered firing range. Thatch was alone with no support. He had spent 4 months analyzing the weave and understood its underlying geometry. He recognized that the concept depended on movement and positioning rather than the number of aircraft. He executed a sharp right turn and then immediately reversed left. These were abrupt directional changes rather than the continuous turning pattern the Zeros expected. The lead Zero followed the initial turn, but Thatch had already reversed direction. The Zero pilot had to adjust and exert more effort, losing energy in the process. Thatch repeated the maneuver. A right turn followed by a left reversal. Each time, the Zero pilot reacted slightly late, continuously adjusting. Each correction reduced speed and reduced the advantage of altitude. After about 40 seconds of repeated reversals, the Zero was at the same altitude and speed as Thatch, with no remaining advantage. The Zero disengaged and climbed away. The other two Zeros followed. Thatch had demonstrated that the core principle of the weave could still be applied without a wingman. Frequent direction changes and unpredictable movement forced the opponent to react and lose energy until disengagement became necessary. He landed on Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett had already returned. His aircraft had sustained 4 hits, but the engine remained functional long enough to reach the carrier. The rest of Fighting Squadron 3 was already in debriefing. They had observed Thatch's engagement and saw that he survived against 3 Zeros alone. Information spread across the fighter squadrons that same day. The weave was effective even in difficult conditions. By evening, pilots from USS Enterprise, CV-6, and USS Hornet, CV-8, requested explanations of the tactic. Thatch demonstrated the method with matches and explained the geometry and reversals. Some pilots began practicing immediately. Training flights were conducted over the carrier groups to refine timing and coordination. By June 5, 18 Wildcat pilots could perform the maneuver. By June 6, 32 pilots were capable of executing it. The method spread through the fleet more quickly than formal doctrine. Japanese pilots also recognized the change. Intercepted communications from June 7 included references to new American tactics. Reports described coordinated pairs and unpredictable flight patterns that reduced vulnerability. One intercepted message noted that American Wildcat pilots had changed their methods and that stronger resistance should be expected. On June 10, Fighting Squadron 3 conducted combat air patrol over a convoy near Midway Atoll. 8 Wildcats encountered 14 Zeros. Thatch ordered the weave and all 4 pairs executed the maneuver. The Zeros attempted standard tactics by isolating targets and using maneuverability. Each time a Zero moved onto a Wildcat, the pilot turned toward his wingman. Each attempt to separate a pair was countered by coordinated movement. After 12 minutes, the Zeros disengaged. 2 Wildcats were damaged but no pilots were lost. 3 Zeros were shot down. This marked the first time Wildcats achieved a favorable result against Zeros in a major engagement. Command leadership then gave the tactic formal attention. On June 15, Thatch received orders to report to Pearl Harbor and brief Chester Nimitz. The Navy intended to evaluate whether the weave should become official doctrine. Thatch arrived on June 18 and spent 2 days preparing detailed material. He organized diagrams, combat observations, pilot feedback, and statistical results to demonstrate effectiveness. While Thatch prepared his presentation, Japanese forces were also analyzing the tactic. They studied the weave and developed a counter-approach designed to break the coordination and engage multiple directions at once. On June 21, Thatch presented the weave to Admiral Nimitz. 2 days later, Fighting Squadron 3 encountered 18 Zeros over Santa Cruz Islands. These Zeros used methods intended to counter the weave. On June 23, 1942 at 0815 hours, the squadron was escorting a convoy when radar detected incoming aircraft. There were 18 contacts approaching from the northwest at a distance of 12 miles. Thatch had 8 Wildcats arranged in 4 pairs using the weave formation. The tactic had been authorized for field use, but this engagement would test it against an informed opponent. The Zeros approached at 16,000 feet but did not dive immediately. They circled and maintained position. Thatch observed this delay, which differed from standard attack patterns. After about 90 seconds, the formation divided. 6 Zeros moved left, 6 moved right, and 6 remained at higher altitude. The attack was organized from 3 directions. This indicated that the Japanese understood the limitation of the weave when facing multiple angles simultaneously. At 0817, the attack began. 6 Zeros descended from above while 6 approached from each side. Thatch ordered the weave, but the pilots had to decide which direction to counter. Bassett turned toward the high group, exposing his flank to the right side formation. Another pilot moved to support him, which disrupted coordination with his own wingman. The formation broke apart, and the Wildcats were forced into individual engagements. This was the exact condition the Japanese had intended to create. John Thatch recognized the situation as it developed. He saw the weave breaking down and immediately used his radio. Reform pairs. Stay with your wingmen. Execute the standard weave. Ignore the other attacking groups. His pilots followed the instruction. Bassett turned sharply toward his wingman, located him, and re-established position. They resumed the weave even while Zeros approached from multiple directions. The high group descended. Bassett turned toward his partner, and the Zeros followed directly into his wingman's firing line. 2 Zeros were destroyed, and the rest pulled away. The left group attempted an attack next from 14,000 feet. Thatch and his wingman executed the same maneuver. 1 Zero committed to the approach, entered the crossing pattern, and was hit by sustained fire. It fell away trailing smoke. The right group engaged Sheedy's pair and encountered the same result. The weave remained intact, and another Zero was lost. After 8 minutes, Japanese forces had lost 5 Zeros, while the Americans had not lost any Wildcats. The coordinated 3-direction attack had not succeeded. Thatch understood the broader implication. The Japanese had adapted. They had analyzed the weave and designed counter-tactics. Even though those tactics did not succeed, it showed that the method was being taken seriously at a command level. That evening, Thatch submitted a detailed report. He described the multi-direction attack and confirmed that the weave remained effective under pressure. He recommended immediate full adoption without further delay or testing. The evidence showed that the weave worked against standard and adapted tactics. The report reached Chester Nimitz on June 25, and it was forwarded to Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the fleet. King reviewed the engagement results, including the kill ratio and survival data. 8 Wildcats had faced 18 Zeros with no American losses and 5 confirmed Japanese losses. On June 29, King issued Fleet Order 41-1942. All fighter squadrons in the United States Pacific Fleet were required to adopt the Thatch weave as standard combat procedure. Training became mandatory, and the tactic was to be used in all engagements. What began as a simple matchstick concept became official Navy doctrine. However, implementation required time. Orders needed to reach each squadron, and pilots required training and practice. Japanese forces continued operations without delay. On July 7, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros engaged 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons. Some pilots had been trained in the weave, while others had not. The difference became clear. On July 7, 1942, 12 Wildcats conducted combat air patrol over Henderson Field. 4 pilots used the weave and formed pairs immediately. The remaining 8 pilots fought independently using traditional methods. After 22 minutes, 6 Wildcats had been shot down. All losses came from the pilots who fought alone. The 4 pilots using the weave survived without damage and reported 7-0 kills. William Halsey reviewed the report and issued immediate instructions. Every fighter pilot in the South Pacific would be trained in the weave within 2 weeks. Training programs began on July 10. Thatch traveled to Guadalcanal and spent 3 weeks instructing squadrons. He conducted briefings, flight training sessions, and debriefings daily. He demonstrated the concept with matches, explained the structure, and flew practice patterns. Some pilots learned quickly, while others required more time, but all were trained. By August 1, 96 Wildcat pilots could perform the weave. By September 1, that number reached 214. The tactic expanded beyond the Pacific, reaching Atlantic units, carrier groups, and land-based squadrons. It was adopted by different aircraft including Lockheed P-38 Lightning and Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Some bomber crews also applied similar crossing patterns for defensive coordination. The results were measurable. In June 1942, before the WWII became standard, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 0.4 to 1 against Zeros. For every 10 American aircraft lost, about 4 Zeros were destroyed. By October 1942, after widespread adoption, the ratio improved to about 2.1 to 1. American pilots were now destroying 2 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. Japanese pilots recognized the change. Intercepted communications in September showed squadron leaders advising pilots not to pursue American fighters in tail chases and not to follow them into coordinated firing positions created by their wingmen. Disengaging when Americans used coordinated tactics meant giving up the fight and allowing American fighters to protect their bombers, which reduced Japanese control of the air. The Zero remained faster and more maneuverable than the Wildcat, but those advantages had limited value if a pilot could not secure a firing position. The WWII made it extremely difficult to align guns on target. By January 1943, the tactic had become standard doctrine across all United States fighter squadrons. The United States Army Air Forces adopted it, the United States Marine Corps adopted it, and pilots from the Royal Navy also began learning it for carrier operations. A method that began with 2 matches on a desk in San Diego became a core element of Allied fighter doctrine. John Thatch received the Navy Cross in February 1943. The citation recognized his role in developing tactics that saved many American lives and strengthened naval aviation operations. However, Thatch focused less on recognition and more on results. In the 6 months before the WWII, the United States Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. In the 6 months after the tactic became standard, losses dropped to 41. This represented dozens of pilots who returned safely because of coordinated flying. In March 1943, Thatch was reassigned to training duties and removed from combat. He returned to San Diego to teach the WWII to new pilots. He preferred operational flying but was informed that his impact as an instructor was greater. Over the next 18 months, he trained more than 800 naval aviators. Each pilot carried the method into combat and applied it in situations where survival would otherwise have been unlikely. Many later credited the training for their survival. The war ended in August 1945. Thatch was 40 years old. He had flown 73 combat missions, achieved 6 confirmed victories, and received multiple decorations including the Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Crosses, and Air Medals. However, the most important outcome was the number of pilots who survived because they understood the WWII. Estimates indicate that more than 2,000 American pilots benefited from the tactic. After the war, Thatch chose to remain in the Navy rather than return to civilian life. His family had spent years apart from him, but continuing service allowed him to keep training pilots and improving tactics. Over the next 27 years, he focused on instruction and development rather than direct combat. He was promoted to commander in 1946, captain in 1952, and rear admiral in 1960. During the Korean War, he commanded carrier groups. Although he did not return to combat flying, his pilots did, and they continued using the WWII. Fighter pilots began referring to it as the Thatch WWII, and it became one of the few tactics named after an individual during their lifetime. During the Vietnam War, the concept evolved. McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II pilots adapted the method for higher speeds and called it Fluid 4 formation. The principle remained the same, using coordinated movement and crossing patterns. American pilots applied it against aircraft such as the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-17, which had maneuverability advantages similar to the Zero. The approach remained effective even at much higher speeds. Thatch retired from the Navy in 1973 after 4 decades of service. He returned to San Diego and lived a quiet life. He rarely discussed his wartime experience or the number of pilots affected by his work. When asked about the WWII, he described it as a response to necessity rather than innovation. He explained that his primary goal was to ensure that his pilots returned safely. Naval aviators continued to recognize his contribution. Each year on February 10, the date of the first combat use of the WWII, pilots would contact him to express appreciation and share experiences. In 1981, the Navy named Thatch Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola in his honor. The facility serves as a training center, and every naval aviator passes a plaque that emphasizes the principles of innovation, adaptation, and survival. Thatch passed away on April 15, 2001 at the age of 86. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by hundreds of naval aviators from different generations. Many had flown in World War II, others in later conflicts, and all had been influenced by the same tactical concept. Today, the Thatch WWII remains part of training at fighter pilot schools across the United States military. The United States Navy, United States Air Force, and Marine aviation units continue to teach updated versions adapted for modern aircraft and combat conditions. The core idea has not changed. Two aircraft operate together, support each other, and maintain coordinated movement to survive. The National Naval Aviation Museum preserves Thatch's original matches in a display case alongside a model of the Grumman F4F Wildcat. The display explains that these simple objects contributed to a tactical development that saved thousands of lives. Visitors pass the exhibit daily. While many continue walking, trained pilots often stop and study it, recognizing the significance behind a simple idea.